I have today is a breakdown of an inspector general report, a Pentagon inspector general, and they're looking into sexual assault at the Pentagon. And this article from Task and Purpose is titled, "The Pentagon has said for years that tackling sexual assault is a top priority. A new report shows the opposite." And so, what the Inspector General report does, and again, this is the Pentagon investigating itself, and we've discussed on recent shows how, with things even as serious as committing war crimes in Afghanistan or Syria, the Inspector Generals are more than willing to go along and cover it up. And it seems that this is the exact case here. The extent of the sexual assault, harassment, rape problem, targeting female service women in the military is extensive. Like the reports and the polling say up to like 50% of female service women say that this has happened to them. And so this is a really serious problem, and it's been known about for well over a decade now. You could go back, and this article does have quotes from several former heads of the Department of Defense saying that, like, hey, we're going to look into this, we're going to address it, we're going to make it a top priority, and that just hasn't been the case. Some of the numbers here find that the DoD essentially has not increased its budget and has not hired more people to deal with domestic assault and sexual abuse in the workplace and to carry out these investigations. These investigations need to be handled in a specific way to empower the victims of the abuse, and to make sure that this isn't going to be covered up, or that this is going to be handled in a way that they feel uncomfortable with. If it's a case of domestic violence or something like that, there may be kids involved. And so having people who have experience with this is extremely important. And it found in the Army did not assign the correct investigators in 9% of cases, which honestly isn't that extreme. It's not great, but you assume that like in some small percentage this will happen. The Navy is doing poorly, not doing it in 16% of the cases, and the Air Force only 44% of the time they're doing it correctly. 66% of the time they're not assigning the correct investigators to and look into these crimes. They also found that despite requirements and policy, they found that 50% of the time in the Army, 59% of the time in the Navy, 94% of the time in the Air Force, and 11% of the time in the Marine Corps, they did not go through the correct policy. And so obviously, they're really not even trying here. The Pentagon's excuse is that it's a funding issue. It's a resource issue. This is the $800 billion a year agency complaining that they don't have enough money to look into and make sure they're protecting the women that they bring into the service. One of the striking things about this, and something that we've addressed on the show, but is been just talked about widely, is the Pentagon is constantly trying to recruit more and more women into the military. And hell, we'll talk about later in the show, they're looking to make women register for the draft and put them in an environment where they're obviously so likely to be victimized. This is just absolutely crazy. So, we see from the report from the and Pentagon Inspector General that this is not being addressed. But, to look at it actually through the lens of a servicewoman who has been victimized, we have a Marine who has published an open letter at Task and Purpose titled, "Sir, you know what you did to me," an open letter to the Marine General handling my sexual harassment case. I believe her name is Sybil Greenberg, and I'm not 100% certain if this is like maybe a pseudonym to protect her identity, but it does seem like this is a person, so I'm assuming that this actually did happen to her. She writes, "Last month I was asked to provide you," this is written to the person in the military, the commanding officer who is overseeing her case, and all the details will come out here. "You with a written recommendation after my complaint of sexual trauma was substantiated. As this topic is a topic that continues to affect more than 50% of American service women, I've decided to do so in an open letter. I believe our best chance at changing this pervasive culture of abuse is by raising the iron curtain that usually keeps our military and civilian worlds apart and engaging the American public in an honest, transparent conversation. Here is my recommendation. I respectfully request that the Marine officer who continually sexually harassed me over the course of several months not be allowed to remain in the service, let alone hold a command. And so that's the start of her letter. I think it's very strong, and I mean, from my point, that this is her letting him off easy. Obviously, as detailed to come, what he did is on the lines of criminal and should probably face some charges, not just be removed from the service, but dishonorably discharged. That way he doesn't continue to profit off of the American taxpayer dime. She goes on to write that I am disappointed by the lack of action taken so far to hold this Marine accountable. Sir, you know what he did to me. You read the 100-page investigation that looked into and confirmed the unwelcome sexual advances, the deliberate and repeated offensive comments, including accusing me of being a high-class escort, the salacious, rampant rumors he started about me that not only harmed my career but also affected the officers of much higher rank, the attempts to control what I wrote and who I spent time with, the frightening alcohol-triggered mood swings, and subsequent escalation between verbal berating and psychopathic praise. Towards the end of our time serving together, he texted, I'm very proud to have known someone as extraordinary as you. And so this is, just a very abusive kind of thing where, the person is very rude and demean and all that, but then will attempt to build you up and everything. She also writes that, and yet he turned Camp Barrett into the most hostile workplace that I have ever known. Although my allegations were substantiated by an independent military officer almost 5 months ago, this lieutenant continues to execute his daily duties as an officer and was just recently in charge of an entire platoon of enlisted Marines. So far, you have only issued a page 11 counseling, an administrative document that does a little more than a slap on the wrist for his misconduct. I hope that this update provides you with some closure in that matter. One of the judge advocates overseeing the case recently told the writer of this Marine Greenberg. Sir, I ask you to reconsider such a mild reprimand in light of the abuse that I suffered. This is what closure, not justice, looks like. She says, this is not what closure nor justice looks like. Okay. If you want, you can read the rest of the article. She goes in and documents some more of the abuse that's very, common in the military and everything like that. But here you have a case where you have a 100-page report finding that this man, took a subordinate and, just made extremely offensive comments to her. But not only that, started salacious rumors about her being an escort, and sounds like, saying that she was hooking up with higher level officers and all this. I mean, this is really something that's going to hurt and destroy her career and change the way that her coworkers look at her to start this kind of rumor. And that they've let him stay in charge after knowing this for an additional 5 months to potentially continue to abuse and make other victims is extremely disturbing, and just really goes to back up what even the Pentagon's own Inspector General found. And so while the Pentagon says, hey, it's a funding and resource issue and all this, okay, well, let's see. The Pentagon is now expected to spend $200 billion, $203 billion to be exact, over the next 30 years for the B-21, the new generation of bomber the U.S. is building. This project has been going on for a few years now, but this is the first time we're getting a real public estimate from the Air Force on the price, and they expect to purchase 100 of these aircraft, but they're not in service yet. And so, that $200 billion goes now, and that they're starting spending and all of that. They estimate that the planes are going to cost $639 million each, and all these estimates, I believe, are 2019 dollars, and that $25 billion of the money is going to be in development, and $64 billion to build production. I really don't understand why the Pentagon is paying, I believe, Northrop Grumman all this money to develop and have production for the plane, and then also to continue to pay them for maintenance of the plane and all that. If the Pentagon is going to pay for the development and the production of the plane, then the Pentagon should just own the whole process. This is essentially just allowing privatization of some of our taxpayer dollars to corrupt officials who will give themselves massive bonuses. This is the kind and make sure that a lot of this money gets funneled into the media and think tanks to ensure producing reports that demand more warfare, more drones, and all of that. Also in this report, it details that the Air Force Secretary, Frank Kendall, cannot have a real role in the development of this plane because he was formerly involved and a representative, a lobbyist, I believe, for Northrop Grumman. And so this is absolutely unbelievable. You think it would be something that would absolutely disqualify him as a pick. This is, I believe, the biggest dollar ticket item that the Air Force currently has, and the head of the Air Force cannot oversee it because he was formerly working with the company. Not only that, it's all these conflicts of interest, right? Like if you're this guy's number two, you know that you're only in charge of this right now because your former boss worked for Northrop Grumman. And so, if you're doing things to benefit Northrop Grumman to give them more money, then, likely you're going to see some kickbacks and favorability from your boss, because we know how corrupt and the revolving door and all this works in Washington and the Pentagon. And so I'm sure this plane is going to cost the American taxpayers a hell of a lot more than $200 billion, but we are getting some initial estimates at this point. And one thing I'll point out is one of the reasons that the Air Force is saying this now is to make sure that people aren't surprised later on when we find out how much this plane cost. So when it costs a lot more, they're gonna be like, yeah, but it's only up, a couple $100 million from the initial estimate or something like that to try to minimize it. Also talking about how the Pentagon wastes money, there's this report from Task and Purpose, and I'm convinced we only know the truth is because they figured out a solution. But the title of this article is How One Airman Fits the Air Force's Night Vision Problem with a 4-cent chunk of plastic. What actually happened here is the Air Force bought a bunch of advanced night vision goggles that also had thermal and all this other stuff, and they paid $19,000 a piece for them. I didn't actually find how many they bought, but at least for an entire unit, they have all these night vision goggles. Well, guess what? The Air Force has to continue to use the old ones because these can't mount to the Air Force helmets, and they don't have the new helmets coming anytime soon. And so eventually some, very ambitious airman figures out how to, kind of 3D print and engineer a piece of plastic that will clip these two things together. But if not for that, the Air Force was basically just fine with wasting tens of thousands of dollars on this equipment. And look, I formerly worked in a social work type job. I know how much people get paid who are domestic abuse, like counselors and stuff like that. What the Pentagon, we're talking just a few of these infrared units that would, make up for some of the positions that are drastically lacking at the Pentagon. As in 2011, they had 2,640 reports of sexual assault or harassment in the workplace, and that number in 2019 was 5,699, and they haven't hired any new people to deal with that amount of cases in that time. Maybe if they're buying a little, some fewer bombers, they could actually protect the women that they claim to care about so much and why them on their ranks so badly. We have General Atomics announced they're building a new drone. They were recently testing this, and one of the very important things about this drone is that it has a payload a lot larger than the other U.S. armed drones. I believe the Reaper could carry 4 Hellfire missiles, and I think it's the Predator or the Gray Eagle that could carry 8. This would be able to carry 16, so this is a much larger load that this would be able to carry. And also wonder what other kind of technology that they're putting upgrades and advancement on in this new drone that they're developing. No idea how much it's going to cost yet, who's going to buy it, but this is some of the first reporting we're getting about this drone. We have the announcement that the Pentagon has failed its 4th audit. It's never passed an audit, so it's only had 4 audits, and it's failed every single one of them. The Pentagon insists that they're making good progress, although the audits only covered 37% of the assets of the Pentagon, and only 6 of the audits of the 26 different audits for the Pentagon actually passed. And so even though they're only looking at a small fraction, about a third of the Pentagon spending, the Pentagon's assets, they're still not able to pass in a large number of the audits. And so this is incredibly discouraging, despite what the Pentagon is going to tell you, which is, hey, we're making good progress, we're getting closer here. Just think of how many billions of dollars are being stolen from the American taxpayer every year. We let the Pentagon go on with this lack of oversight. Something else important here is that the Pentagon is only estimating that they're going to be able to pass an audit by 2027. There was a recent bill that was introduced, I believe, in the Senate, not the House, that would take 1% of the Pentagon's budget every year that they were unable to pass an audit after next year. Now, this won't pass, and we're talking about like $8 billion, which, as you'll see when we're talking about the NDAA, the Pentagon funding bill, in a moment, is probably meaningless chump change really to the Pentagon, and they'll throw a fit and probably get that money through like a slush fund or something else. But anyways, the Pentagon won't be able to make that, so I don't even expect that legislation to pass. Of the 26 audits that they actually conducted, 2 are not completed yet, 6 passed, 1 failed, and 27 they rendered no opinion, which means that it would have failed, I guess, is like getting an incomplete in a class rather than taking an F or something like that. I'm not an accountant. I don't know all the technical phrases and everything exactly what they mean. Overall, this audit costs the taxpayer $200 million. And again, it's just absolutely insulting and a slap in the face that they're going to get $200 million to conduct an audit, and they're not even looking at a fraction of half of their assets. Absolutely absurd. So we have some statements from the Pentagon on the strike in Syria that was recently uncovered and reported on by the New York Times. Clear war crimes. We had high-ranking military officials attempt to get some kind of justice, some kind of investigation into those war crimes, and were just consistently ignored. All that's laid out in the New York Times piece, which I covered on Monday's show with Patrick McFarlane. But here, the Pentagon is addressing and apologizing for an aspect of that strike. However, it's not what you think. They're saying they're apologizing because they misreported what kind of weapons were used in the strike. Initially, they reported it was a 500-pound bomb and then 2 1,000-pound bombs. And what they now say are they were all 3 500-pound bombs, just different variants of 500-pound bombs. Now, to use the word apologize with this is incredibly insulting. Say that we have to make a clarification or something like that. It's absolutely meaningless, of course, whether the people were vaporized by a 2,000-pound bomb or just blown in half by a 500-pound bomb makes relatively little difference to the children that were killed and the families that lost their children, their wives, their loved ones, and stuff like this. It doesn't seem like as of yet the Pentagon is really interested in doing anything about this. We have our Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin being asked to be briefed on those strikes, and while it's nice that maybe he's taking a mild interest in this, look, you've had two situations in the past couple of months but that have come out about CENTCOM, I believe all while under the direction of General Kenneth McKenzie. All of this has been done while General Mark Milley was the head of the Joint Chiefs. You have to start at the top and you have to start firing people if you're Lloyd Austin, and if you're Biden you really need to be looking at Lloyd Austin too. But none of this is happening. No heads are going to roll. Nobody is going to be charged for war crimes that left scores of women and children dead. Absolutely the most horrific thing that could happen. And they didn't even bother to investigate, even though it was reported, well documented on video at high levels. Austin did make some statements about the airstrike, but he just said we must work harder to, make sure this doesn't happen. We're really dedicated to making sure this doesn't happen again. All empty words, all empty gestures, and suggests to me that the Pentagon really doesn't plan to do anything about this, and it's just looking to sweep it under the rug. Made some platitudes, hold an investigation, and then say, you know what, we found out we need to change like this one policy, but everything else is fine.